Hello and welcome to Colred Plays Raid Shadow Legends. I am Colred. Thank you for joining me. In today's video, I am going to be talking about how to build a Faction Wars team. Now, Faction Wars are incredibly important to farm because there are certain resources that you can only get there. First of all, you can get glyphs there. It's your best source for glyphs, but you can also get forged materials for the resilience and perception sets. The perception set specifically is a great set, not only in the early game, but right on through into the very end game. In fact, on my account, I think I have more perception sets than any other kind of set in the game. So we want to get into Faction Wars early. We want to stay in there through the mid game and the late game. And then eventually we want to close out all of the faction crypts if we can. Because if you can get 63 stars on every single faction, you get an amazing champion as a final reward, and that is Lydia the Deathsiren. Now remember, I'm a free-to-play player, so my focus is always going to be getting the most progress for the least resources. So we're going to talk about how to build your Faction War crypts as painlessly as possible, and to get the most value out of your roster, not only in Faction Wars, but everywhere else as well. There's a lot to cover in this video, so let's get started. Okay, a very brief summary of Faction Wars. Each of the factions in the game has its own crypt. That crypt consists of 21 stages. Each stage is a 3-round fight. You have 3 waves to fight through. At stage 7, 14, and 21, you fight a boss. So if we go in here to the Ogren Tribe crypt, you can see this is the exact same layout that every single faction crypt will have. 6 stages that drop rare materials up to a boss at stage 7. From stage 7 to stage 12, you can get epic materials. At stage 13, that shifts to legendary materials. Stage 14 is a boss, and then you stay all the way through until stage 21, which is also a boss. One of the things to note about Faction Crypt is in order to get 3 stars on any stage, you need to bring in 5 champions, so a full team, and all of the champions must live through the fight. Now, champions can die and be revived, that's totally fine, but when the last minion or the boss dies in the final round, all 5 of your champions must be alive at that point in order for you to get 3 stars. The factions themselves are open for 24 hours each, and they rotate on roughly a 10-day or 12-day schedule, I believe. Some days you'll have 3 open like we have today, and other days you'll only have 2 open. And you can see every single faction has a timer above its flag to let you know exactly how long before it opens up. Now, I like to mentally break up each crypt into 4 distinct phases. The first phase I associate with the first 6 floors. So this is very, very early game stuff, or at least it's early crypt stuff, right? Because you could be at a very late floor, very advanced stage in one crypt, and at the very beginning of a different crypt. So each crypt sort of has its phases detached from every other crypt, depending on your roster. So the first 6 stages drop only rare materials, and there are no bosses. Once you can get through the first boss, you have entered phase 2, and I think phase 2 lasts right up until stage 13. At stage 14, you have entered the 3rd phase, which is getting through this boss, and I think that phase 3 is the shortest phase, at least in terms of the number of stages, because I think it probably only lasts until about stage 17, so stage 14 through 17. The reason is as soon as you get to stages 18, 19, 20 in most faction crypts, the waves get a lot more difficult, and then obviously you get up until the final boss. So the last 4 floors or so of every crypt are extremely difficult compared to the rest. So if we consider stage 1 is sort of the early game stage where we don't really worry about building a faction crypt team. I put together a whole different video, it's been up for about a month, about the early part of the Faction Crypts game. So in the first 30 to 60 days, you probably want to be following the advice of that video. So I'm not going to repeat that here. You can go and watch that video and see what that's all about. But the basics are you want to get in here with whatever champions you can, even if those are farm champions that you are farming up specifically for food, but you can use them in Faction Crypts in the meantime. Same thing with fusion champs or any champs that you have. You just need to get in here and start farming these materials. But eventually you will start collecting champions that you intend to keep at least in the midterm or even long term. And that is where you're going to start breaking into phase 2. Now, starting in phase 2 and going all the way until you have completely mastered any particular crypt, you want to keep a team building picture in mind. So let's talk about what you need to build a successful faction crypt team. Okay, so here we have my Ogryn faction crypt team. This is the team that can farm all the way up to stage 21. But I want to take you into stage 20 first, because sometimes stage 18, 19, or 20 can actually be even tougher than the final boss. So let's jump into this faction crypt. And when we're taking on any wave content, if you watch my videos, you may have heard me talk about this before, but we have 3 primary ways we can deal with any wave content. So whether that's faction crypts, Doom Tower, the waves in dungeons before you get to the boss, or whatever, even arena, which is basically a single wave of wave-based content, you have 3 primary methods of getting through wave-based content. The first is nuking out the enemy wave before they even go. So you're going to prioritize speed, damage, maybe debuffs in order to maximize that damage. Now, this gets trickier because the higher you go in the stages, the higher you go in the Doom Tower floors, the more stats these enemies have, and the faster they go, and the tougher they are to take down. So unless you have an incredibly powerful go-first team that is specialized in wave clearing, for instance, a seer-based team, you're going to struggle with nuking out the enemy waves. So if you have a good team like that, you can go ahead and try it. But for faction crypts, in a lot of cases, you won't be able to get those teams together in too many factions. So you're going to want to try one of the other 2 methods available. The second one is to tank up the waves. Build a tanky team with a lot of heals, shields, maybe block damage buffs. You want to have any kind of buffs that can extend your life, whether that is strengthen or a block debuffs buff or continuous heals or revive on death. Whatever it happens to be, you want to tank up the waves. The enemy waves will get their turns, but hopefully you can survive those waves and continue to push on. A key component of a team like this, which is the current team that we have in front of us, is having a reviver. Now I have Ugo here. Ugo is my reviver. And then the rest of my champions are other utility and damage-based champions, but I have heals here. I have a unkillable buff. I have block debuffs. So I have all of the components of a tanky team. Now, the third possibility is a crowd control team. So you can bring in stuns, freezes, sleeps, provokes, turn meter control, slows, anything that you can get in order to prevent the enemy from taking turns. That's what you want to bring. Now, crowd control can work well as a mix with the other 2 compositions. So you can do some crowd control with a nuke-based team. You can do some crowd control with a tank-based team. So it works pretty well together, but it's difficult to do a nuke-based team and mix it with a tank-based team. Sometimes you can get away with that in some factions, but in most cases, you're going to do one of these 3 methods or some combination of these 3 methods. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and let this team run its way through. And what you're going to see is we have plenty of AoE damage here. We also have some good single target damage. We have a ton of debuffs. We have cleanses. We have revives. We have heals. We have everything that we need to make it through wave-based content just fine. But you want to remember, you're not only going to be taking on waves, you are going to be taking on bosses. And the bosses are a whole different matter. So while you want to build one of these 3 types of teams for getting to the boss, you may also want to consider what type of team is going to help you get through that boss. So for some bosses, turn meter control may be a really effective way to control their damage coming into your team and to basically minimize their effect and to make them an easier fight. In other cases, tankiness may be the way to go. You want a lot of heals, you want block damage buffs, maybe you want cleansers to keep your team from getting CC'd like mine currently is. So that's another consideration. But for every faction, you want a little bit of everything. And so you want to look for champions who, one, bring nice AoE damage, two, bring a lot of debuffs. You want to think about a cleanser as a third option. You want some heals as a fourth option. You want some crowd control as a fifth option. So you are looking for champions who do multiple things. Now, it can be really tricky identifying the champions that you need in any particular faction, because if you look at the reviews for any champion in the game, pick one. Just go look at a rare right now in any faction. Chances are it's probably pretty well rated for faction crypts. So even bad champions can be good in faction crypts. Having another body at 5 stars can allow the better champions in your roster just more time to operate, because that cannon fodder is soaking up damage, soaking up focus, soaking up abilities from the enemies. But not every champion is equally valuable in faction crypts. So you'll find some rares who are good faction crypt rares who are rated at like 4.8 for their faction. And then you'll find an incredible legendary who's one of the best 20 legendaries in the game and is rated at a 4.9 for the same faction. And there is a world of difference between that pretty good rare and that amazing legendary. But the ratings doesn't show that. So I'm just going to let this fight finish up. One of the things that's a little bit tricky about this particular floor is there are some block damaged champions. So one of the things you'll notice is that this is not a fast clear, and that's okay. We don't care about fast clears in faction crypts until we start farming specific floors. I'm not farming this floor. I actually don't care about this floor, but in order to get through it, if it takes me 10 minutes and I get through it and I get my 3 stars, then that's all I care about. Okay, so now this is a screen that you should become very familiar with. This is the faction index, or the champion index, and the faction screen. So you can go into any faction here and you can start to plan your faction wars teams. Now I'm going to take you into a faction. We can just randomly pick a faction. Let's go ahead and look at one of the trickier factions maybe. Let's look at Knights Revenant. Okay, now if you have any legendaries at all in a faction, they are natural 5 stars, which means you can get them up to level 50. So those can be considered for faction crypts. But you still want to consider the role. If you are looking for a damage dealer for a faction crypt, you typically want that damage dealer at 6 stars. So unless you're going to level up your legendary to 6 stars, they're just basically going to be another body if they're a damage dealer. So 5-star support champions are a lot more valuable than 5-star damage dealing champions. In terms of epics, this is where you're going to live for most faction crypts. You will take in a few rares, especially earlier in the game, but you should graduate to mostly epic-based teams and eventually to epic and legendary mixed teams. So if I'm looking at this faction, I want to think about the things that I need. Now, the nice thing about my account here is that every single portrait that you see that is lit up, I own all of these champions. In order to light up a portrait, you just have to have gotten a champion once, but I've never fed any of these champions, so I've always kept at least one copy of every epic that I've ever gotten, and therefore all of these champions are available to me. So I do want to think about champions that I've already built for other reasons. They are always going to form the core of any Faction Wars team. So I do have some 6 stars in this faction. Now forget about the legendaries for a moment, and let's just focus on the epics. So I have a 6-star Skull Crown. Now I have a 6-star Skull Crown for other reasons. I didn't build her for faction crypts. She's just a fantastic champion in both the arena and in wave content. So when I got her, I built her out. Now I happen to have Sinesha, who also has an AoE on her A1, and this is Skull Crown's duo. Now my Sinesha is only level 50, so she's not going to hit particularly hard. She's also a support champion, but she is a healer. So she can equalize the HP of all allies and then heals the target ally by 10% of their max HP. And so she can keep your team moving in terms of health. So now that I have my AoE damage and my healer on board, I can start thinking about what else I may have or may want in the team. Now, a Reviver is always a good idea when you're trying to 3-star any faction crypt. So you always want to look for revivers in any faction, and you want a good reviver that can be nice and tanky, preferably at level 50 if you're not going to 6-star that champion. And there is a perfect champion here in this faction, that is Rector Drath. Now, Rector Drath is an excellent champion that is worth a 6-star. You can bring her into Hydra, you can bring her into a lot of places in Doom Tower. She's very powerful. But you don't necessarily need to have her at 6 stars for faction crypts. So the nice thing about supports is they often have decent enough stats that you can make them nice and tanky with only 5 stars. And if they're just doing one job, which is reviving or healing, then they can do that job really well at 50. So one of the things I like to do is identify every epic and rare reviver in any given faction. Now, not every faction will have a rare reviver, some don't, and some will have very few epic revivers. In fact, in the Knights Revenant faction, there has only been one in the rare or epic category, and that has been Rector Drath. Now, Rector Drath is an incredibly powerful champion. She's a really good healer and a single target reviver. She also has a decreased attack on her A1. She's very good for Hydra Clan Boss. She's very good for, you could use her against Clan Boss. You could use her against any bosses, really. She brings a perfect veil, which is damage mitigation for your team as well. She's got nice base stats. You do not need to 6-star this champion, but having her at 5 stars and nice and tanky will be a great way to get 3 stars on every floor in this faction crypt. Because having your reviver who's tanky, even at 5 stars, means that they're unlikely to die, and they can bring up champions who die in order to get you back to a full team composition and get those 3 stars. So I always want to look for a reviver. Now, in this particular faction, they just added a second epic for the ongoing fusion, and that is Malkith. And so now we have 2 options in this faction for revivers. So you should probably level up either Malkith or Rector Drath, or both if you like to, up to at least level 50. So now that I have my damage dealer, my healer, my reviver, who's also a second healer, now I can start thinking about other things that I want to add to the team. Maybe I want to add a little bit of tankiness. Maybe I want to add some cleanses. Maybe I want to add some block debuffs. Some stuns are always good. Some turn meter control is always good. But again, don't just start building champions that fill these roles. You want to make sure that you are building, especially if you're a free-to-play player, you want to make sure that you're building champions that you would use in other content. So like I said, Rector Drath is great in Hydra. She's great in Doom Tower. She's great in other places. Skullcrown is an excellent arena nuker, so I can use her there. I can also use her in a stun set against wave content in Doom Tower because she has an AoE on her A1 and an AoE on her A2. So these are 2 champions that I will have built for other reasons, and now they begin to form the core of my Faction Wars team. However, every team that you have, every faction that you have, you're going to have different champions. So if I looked at a different faction, let's say I might not have some AoE damage, I might want to go out and consider building a 6-star damage dealer in that faction. Or I can potentially go pure tank and heals and defense, and that's fine, and just grind the enemy down. But I want to make sure that I can get through the bosses because some of the bosses heal themselves. So if I'm not bringing enough damage to burn through it, I have to find a way to get through that boss, either by bringing more damage or potentially maybe, I forget if they can be heal debuffed, right? You can potentially put a decrease healing debuff, or you can turn meter control the boss so they never get an opportunity to heal. So there are other ways to deal with it, but you have to find one of those solutions available in each and every single faction. So if we go back to the faction crypt here and we talk about phase 2, phase 2 is going to be getting through this stage 7 boss. And that's probably going to happen as soon as you get 1 or 2 level 50 champs. Maybe you'll need a level 60. Each faction is a little bit different, and depending on which champion you've leveled up, you may get stalled out here at boss 1. But put a bunch of 4-star champions around a good 5-star champion, and chances are you'll be able to move into phase 2 comfortably. Again, even at this point, the majority or the core of your Faction Wars team should be a mix of champions that you are leveling up anyway, and then any hang-around champions that you just happen to have who are epics in that faction, or maybe a rare that you've taken up to level 40. You don't want to start making 5 stars for faction crypts. That's a bad idea in phase 1 and phase 2. In fact, it's not even a great idea for phase 3, but you might have enough resources to start doing that once you're comfortably into phase 3 for a number of factions. So phase 3 is really about getting through stage 14 and pushing up higher into or lower into the faction crypt. And this is where you may start to make decisions with faction crypts in mind. This is not a time when you want to 6-star a champion specifically for faction wars. But if you have 2 champions who do similar jobs or who could both benefit you to an equal degree. And one of them is in a faction that you have underrepresented, or one of them is in a faction where you're getting close to finishing off that faction and you just need a little help. You could potentially choose your next 6-star with that tiebreaker in mind. So if I have 6 high elves at level 60 already, I might be less inclined to level up another high elf, and I would rather get whatever role or benefit I'm looking for from a different faction where I lack power in that faction's crypt. Now, once you get to phase 4 and you are in the last few stages here and you're trying to get to that final boss, this is where you want to start to think about specific champions that you can take at least to level 50, if not to level 60. Consider those block debuff champions, those cleanse champions, those healing champions, those revivers, especially. You're always looking for a reviver in every single faction, and those turn meter control champions, because those are the types of champions that are going to help you with the stage 21 boss. You do want some damage on the team, but you can defeat this boss with no particular damage dealers in most cases, whereas you can rarely get through this boss with all damage dealers. You're going to have some supports here. Okay, so now I just want to show you the 3 faction wars teams that I can show for the 3 factions that are open currently. So if we go to the Knights of Revenant, you can see that here I have chosen that team that I already showed you, which has 3 AoE damage dealers. I have an HP burn. I have a lot of heals on this team. I actually have 3 champions that can heal. 2 of them are HP levelers. So Drang and Sinesha here both do healing. I have 3 AoE damage dealers. I do have HP burns from Drang. I have a cleanser who's also a healer, and then I have a reset champion. Now, Renegade is actually a rare that I use on my clan boss team, but because she's at level 60 and because she does some good work in terms of resetting cooldowns, I have her on this team, and she works great here. So this is a good mix of a very tanky team who also brings AoE damage. But you'll notice I have no reviver on this team. Now, if I need to 3-star something, I can always pull out, say, Renegade, and I can put in my level 50 Rector Drath, and now I'm going to be able to 3-star that floor. But I don't have to 3-star it every time. If I'm just farming a floor, I can pull Rector Drath out, put Renegade in. It will reduce my clear time. Somebody might die, but it's okay because I only need to beat the stage. I don't need to 3-star it anymore. All right, now here is my Ogryn Crypt faction team, and this team is very tanky. So my primary damage dealer here, actually I have 3 damage dealers, but they're all tanky damage dealers. So I have Bellower here, who is my campaign farmer. He's pretty slow, but he has AoEs on every hit. I have a Man-Eater here who has an unkillable buff and a block debuffs buff, which is really nice. He also has a 100% AoE decrease attack, which is great. He can also steal turn meter, which is great. He's a very powerful champion. Gribtuck is sort of a weird legendary who I built and put on the team at level 50, and he does fine. He's not a great champion. He's kind of a weird champion, but another 5-star legendary body here provides a lot of distraction for the enemies. They have to burn through his HP pool. He's obviously putting out his skills as well. I have Grush, who is not only my defensive aura champion, but provides heals. And then I have Ugo, who provides revives and debuffs. So this is a very tanky team with very little damage. It has just enough damage to get through the waves, but it does well against bosses because primarily Man-Eater hits so hard and has that 100% turn meter reduction. So a mix of AoEs and single target damage here with a lot of heals, tankiness, debuffs, and revives. Now here is my Shadowkin Crypt, and this is going in the other direction. In this case, I actually have 3 damage dealers, or sort of 2.5 damage dealers. Hatatsu at level 50 provides the only real tankiness in the team. He has an increased defense and also some continuous heals. I have Ninja and Genbo, who are my clan boss damage dealer and my arena nuker respectively. So they are built very well and they bring a ton of damage. They can both do single target damage well, and they can both do AoE damage well. Lady Kimmy is the newest addition to this team. She wasn't originally on this team, but she provides a lot of utility in terms of increasing speed and turn meter and some buffs for everybody. And then the actual most important champion on this team is Kinagashi. Kinagashi is the only rare or epic rarity champion that has a revive that is not conditional in the entire roster of this faction. So most revivers in the Shadowkin faction, you have to like kill a target in order to get a revive, but Kinagashi just has a single target revive, and so she was the key to getting my 3 stars here on stage 21. Prior to getting Kinagashi up to level 50, I actually had cleared this boss relatively easily, but I could never get it with more than 1 star. Kinagashi turned that into a 3-star instantly. So this is more of a nuke-based team with a reviver and a sort of a tank as an emergency backup. Okay, one thing I do want to caution you against is relying too much on the reviews of champions to determine who you're going to level up. For instance, I want to show you something here. In the Shadowkin faction, we have Odachi. Now, Odachi is a good rare. He's not a bad rare, and he's worth building up. He could even be used in faction crypts. But if we go to his reviews, you'll notice that he has green ratings everywhere. And in fact, in the Faction Wars Crypt, he is rated at a 4.8. You have to take these ratings with a grain of salt. He is not as good in all of these places as the epics who are above him in this faction, or in, other rares in other factions. Even though he's rated well, he's not a phenomenal top 10 rare in the game. He's a good rare, and you could build him and you'll get some use out of him. However, I want you to specifically note this faction crypt, the Faction Wars rating of 4.8. Now, if we go and we look at Kinagashi, who I just told you is the only reviver in this faction who is reliable, and the one who basically turned my faction crypt around and got me the 63 stars. If we look at her rating, you'll notice that she is rated poorly in most of the game, below 4 and more than half of her ratings. And as far as Faction Wars, she is rated decently well at 4.7. But this is 4.7. Odachi, who was the rare, was rated at 4.8. For Faction Wars, Kinagashi is incredibly more important than Odachi. It's not even close. This is the only reviver in the faction that you can rely on. So she's more important. She is a 5.0 as far as I am concerned in terms of the faction crypt. The only reason you wouldn't build her is if you went with a tanky team that was so tanky that they would never die. Now, I'm not doing this to prop Kinagashi up, but rather to talk about the importance of certain roles. Having a reviver in every faction is a really good idea. That reviver can be a rare, that reviver can be a legendary, or that reviver can be an epic like Kinagashi here. It doesn't really matter as long as you have one available to you, because that's going to help you build a team that can get 3 stars on every single stage. Okay, so now I want to show you a powerful tool that can help you figure out your roster moving forward. If you go to your roster page here, you can click on this little symbol in the upper left-hand corner, and it will show you the champion filter. Now just go down here to faction, and you can go ahead and filter by any faction. So let's say you were struggling with the Dwarven faction, you could just click on Dwarves here. By the way, I would go up here and include your Master Vault and Reserve Vault, so you will literally see every Dwarf champion you have. Click Hide to hide the filter, and then you can go to the full screen roster, and this will show you every single Dwarf you have. You can even filter this by rarity if you want, or you can filter it by level, whatever you like. So now I'm looking at all of my Dwarven champions. I know I'm struggling here, and I want to say to myself, who do I have? What am I missing? What do I need? So let me go ahead and actually do this by level. Okay, so Brogni, I'm still leveling up. He's not built yet. I'm almost complete with his masteries. So he hasn't been built yet. So let's take him off the board. And you'll notice I have a damage dealer here in Newt. He is also turn meter control. He is a defensive-based nuker. He's very tanky, so he's going to provide a lot of damage. And then I have an AoE damage dealer in Trunda Guilt Mallet. Actually, Newt does both single target and AoEs. So I've got my damage covered. So now I'm looking for a reviver, maybe a healer, some cleanses, a block damage buff, whatever I happen to have. So I've got Runekeeper Dazdirk, who has a cleanse on his A3. He also has turn meter fill. He has a leech on his A1, so that cleanse could play. I do have Demitha here. She is actually 6 stars, so Demitha has a cleanse and a heal. She also has a block damage buff. So all of a sudden, I've got my damage dealers, I've got my cleanser, my healer. Maybe I want to bring in a reviver if I have one. I believe I do. Yeah, in Melga Steel Girdle, I have a reviver here. So that would put together a pretty solid team. 3 supports, 2 damage dealers, some turn meter control, a cleanse, actually 2 cleanses, and a block damage buff, plus a revive if I get in trouble, and I am all set. Now, if you're thinking about what champion to level up next, and maybe you don't have this range available to you, so let's say you just had the 50s, and in fact, maybe you just had from this row down, you could still think about the team in the same way. I want to level up maybe a champion that can provide me with some support, maybe an Avir, maybe a Canelia. I want a damage dealer. I've got Gala Longbraids. I've got Fire Gun Isbel. I want heals. I've got Rearguard Sergeant here. I want a tank. I've got Goffred Brassclad. So start to put together your team in a way that makes sense and think about what champions can be parked at 5 stars permanently and just provide value there at that level. For instance, I think that's probably how I feel about Melga Steel Girdle. I never need to bring her to 6 stars. She's not valuable enough outside of faction crypts. But having her as a 50 in faction crypts makes me certain that I can 3-star every single stage. And so she's worth a 5-star, and I park her there permanently. Once you've gone through this filter for any particular faction, if you are missing champions, missing a job on the team sheet, right? If your composition is missing a reviver, missing an AoE damage dealer, missing a cleanser or a buff stripper or whatever it happens to be that you need, now you can go back into that index and start looking for the champions in that particular faction who fill that role. And this is when you are fully in phase 4 and you are starting to build a lot of 5-star champions in order to start completing your various crypts. You may have to take a champion from 5 stars to 6 stars, maybe one that you've already had built that's been sitting there for a while waiting for you to get the rest of the team around it. But then you get to close out all of those crypts, get your 63 stars everywhere, and pick up your Lydia the Deathsiren. She is definitely worth it. She's worth all the grind, and I happen to find faction crypts a fairly fun challenge. It also makes me concentrate on building champions in different areas and thinking about all the different roles that I need. So I actually feel like from a creative problem-solving perspective, that faction crypts gives me practice in all of the areas that I need to then go out and be good at things like Hydra Clan Boss and Doom Tower Hard Mode. All right, that is it for the Faction Wars tutorial here. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions about anything that I've mentioned today, any specific factions, any specific champions, go ahead and put those in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like button. Definitely subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and consider joining our Discord community. Thanks so much for hanging out. I have been Colred, and I will see you in another video soon.